Well, hello everyone. Welcome to a new edition of Human Dialogues. I'm Jessica Lockhart and I am thrilled, I'm pleased, I'm happy to be here with you one more day. As you know, every month the International Institute of Humanology organizes different events around human topics. And the topic that the Institute is focusing on this month is attachment, a very important topic for human beings. As you know, we organize different events, including these human dialogues, trying to offer you a wider understanding of all these topics. We also try to offer you some tips and ideas and strategies to handle those topics the best way possible. So today I'm going to be talking about attached to my roots. Because you know what? Attachment is not only being attached to people, it can also be attachment to things, to places. That's why it's so important that we realize that we have different types of attachments and how to deal with them. Well, to discuss this incredible, wonderful, interesting topic, I'm going to have a wonderful expert. Somebody I happened to meet in Switzerland when I lived there, and that impressed me right away when I listened to her for the first time. I'm talking about Dr. Christa Uehlinger, who is passionate about helping people leverage cultural differences with openness and curiosity. She holds a PhD from the University of Zurich, is certified by the Intercultural Communication Institute in Portland, and is an IDI qualified administrator and trained in psychosynthesis with Will Parfit. In 2019, she received the Rooney Scholarship from Robert Morris University in Pittsburgh, the United States, and has guest lectured in South Korea and throughout Europe. She has worked for different companies and lived abroad. She launched Linking People practice circles to support and facilitate individuals from all walks of life to work through cross-cultural challenges together. Today, she also continues to lecture at G Mindset Center for Global Education and HWZ, University of Applied Sciences in Business Administration, where in 2024 she received the Best Teaching Award. In 23, Dr. Uehlinger was invited to be a TEDx speaker on the topic of the gift of foreignness. She is the author of Being Different Together and the game puzzling intercultural stories. Is she or is she not quite the expert? I am thrilled to have her with us in one of our events, Human Dialogues. Christa,
Hello.
welcome! Welcome!
Danke. Thank you very much for having me, Jessica. It's a pleasure to
I
be
am
here.
so thrilled to have you, really, because on top of everything, I know that you and I have a lot of things in common in this field. You know, you
Absolutely.
lived abroad, I lived abroad. We are very interested in human beings. But the first thing that I want to discuss with you, and I'm sure that our audience who are already connecting, even from India, I imagine, far away, I think,
Welcome.
yeah, welcome, welcome. The very important first question that I want to ask you is, what does that mean, attached to my roots? How can somebody be attached to somebody's roots?
That's a good question. I was thinking about when I was reflecting on this dialogue and attachment has a lot of different meanings and so on. I think first I would like to use the word connect, connect to your roots. And I think that's very important to connect to your roots in the sense of who I am, what are my roots in intercultural work, especially what is my cultural identity. So I think, and that's a healthy thing to be because a lot of people are not really connected to their roots. So I just was talking to somebody who has 3 different backgrounds. So there's a bit of a connection, but oftentimes people then say, okay, I don't know where I belong. And so there's an identity, an important identity piece missing. Now, when we switch then to attachment, that could, of course, be a bit hindering now and then. But I'd love to start with connection.
It's funny because I remember an anecdote in my own life. I was born in the US. I grew up in Spain, but I already lived in 8 different countries.
Mm,
I have an adopted daughter from Kazakhstan, and my son was born in Spain. So it's
mm.
a very
Very cool.
complex,
Yeah.
multinational situation. And I
Mm,
recall when I was very young and I met my husband. He is Basque. He had only lived in one city in his life apart from moving to Madrid to study. And when we really started dating a little bit more seriously, going steady, as it's usually said,
so
I
steady.
remember, I remember him telling me a little upset, you are a rootless woman. You have no
Mm,
roots.
yeah.
And because I have very deep roots in my Basque land, in my city, I belong here, I know who I am. And I recall telling him, I don't agree. I don't
Mm,
think I'm rootless, but I
mhm.
just happen to carry my roots with me. I
Yeah.
moved.
Exactly.
So that's something I wanted to touch upon. In that case, I think he was much more attached to his
Yeah.
roots than I was.
Absolutely, but probably he wasn't. I assume he wasn't like traveling around and moving around as you did, right? So yeah,
Yes,
and you're more attached to the route. And I think
yes,
that when you travel around a lot, it's important to be connected to your identity. Otherwise, you might get lost. I mean, there are examples of
yes,
being
yes.
lost wherever. And I had another experience. I mean, I was
Mhm.
born in Switzerland and raised in Switzerland and so on. I started to travel later on, but I could travel wherever I went. And people told me, you are not typical Swiss. And and what at one point this really kind of puzzled me because I thought, yeah, who am I? If I, then I felt like this connection to your homeland is very deep and very important. So it was a bit scary. I think at beginning of my 20s and then I realized it's just because from the outside, I think that's also kind of an attachment to the images we have. Um, we have this we have this idea of how people from a different culture should be, and by culture I not only mean nationalities. So and then you're attached to it, and if you don't fulfill it, you count kind of an outsider, which was a very interesting experience. And afterwards, I mean, I was like, okay, tell me what's a typical Swiss. And then
Haha.
oftentimes I realize because I love to joke, I laugh, I connect with people quite quickly, which is not Swiss.
Not very Swiss, no. I must say, not at
So,
all.
so then I started to realize what they mean. But
Yeah.
at the very beginning, in a younger age, I was a bit, yeah, but who am I? It's always also connected to who am I? Yeah.
Mhm. And see, it's funny because one of the things that I saw in people who migrated or who moved, expats, or because of course when you move a bit, you end up meeting a lot of foreigners, a lot.
Mhm.
And one of the things that I observed was that there were like different kinds of people regarding attachment to their roots. There were those who were so deeply attached to the roots
Mhm.
that moving was a disaster.
Yeah.
It completely destroyed them because they were physically here, but their soul, their heart was in their homeland.
Mhm.
And they couldn't enjoy the experience, they couldn't be there. It was absolutely horrifying for them.
Mhm.
And that's not healthy either.
No,
And then
not
you have, yeah, and then you have the ones you mentioned, those who move and move and move and basically get lost. An
Mhm.
example of that could be my own daughter. She was born in Kazakhstan. Well, we suppose she was born in Kazakhstan
Yeah,
because she was abandoned. She was
yeah.
found in the
Oh,
street.
mhm,
And when we adopted her, we first took her to Poland. That's where we were living. But
mhm,
since then, she's 21 and she's lived in 6 different countries.
mhm, mhm.
And she sometimes says, I don't know where I'm from.
Exactly.
And I ended up accepting myself as a third culture kid.
Yeah, exactly.
But so, what do you say about these two extremes? The ones who are so attached and the ones that are a little fleeting and flying.
Yeah, I think I could see both. I mean, in the intercultural field or cultural diversity, we know about culture shock adaptation to a new cultural environment, and that not everybody um, behaves or goes there in the same way. So I saw, for instance, managers who were in a very deep culture shock because as you said, they felt I don't belong here. And then it goes like I can't find my typical food. I don't leave the flat after 6 a.m. in the evening because it's such a dangerous city and things like that. I was supporting a manager. She was sent from Warsaw to Vienna, which you would say is not really far, okay? But for her, it was the first time she traveled outside of her homeland, and she had a huge culture shock. She lost 10 kilograms, and she even lost hairs, and she didn't leave the flat after 6 p.m. too. And so these are people oftentimes not prepared. I think that's also important. Prepare yourself, talk to people in the different places where you go, prepare yourself properly, and how you then that's my experience of all this year, how you react to foreigners, to a foreign country is so individual. There are people who are open-minded and they go there, they connect with people, they are active, and others are there and they're like, oh my God, and shut down and so on. Yeah, so it's very individual.
Yeah. And see, for example, we at the Institute, we also work a little bit on this, not so much and not so academically as you do. We have a program called I Lead My Own Integration, where we help people deal with their own integration in a foreign country. We
Exactly.
deal with the issues that institutions can't help people with, like, for example, that sense of depression sometimes that you might
Yeah,
have because you don't know, you don't fit in, how to deal with socialization, how to deal with fear, all that aspect,
exactly.
the human aspect is what we work on.
Yeah, that's very
And yeah, and it's fundamental because people go through
true.
all this. Yeah.
Absolutely. And I think we
Hmm.
know now research again, we know that this is a huge stress situation,
Yeah.
influenced by certain aspects. And it's not just, and that's why my heart is aching when I see company or university just sending people around without preparing them. So, for instance, this woman I mentioned coming from Warsaw to Vienna, and then I looked at her and she was telling me the story, and I looked at her and I said, "Yeah, I think you are in culture shock." And then
Yeah.
she said, "What is that?" You know. So I explained her. I said that's a normal adaptation process to a new cultural environment because you need to adapt, otherwise you can't live there.
Yeah.
And so she went
And
like, I
uh-huh.
didn't know, she said, I didn't know. I was actually questioning myself because never before in my life did I act like this. And
Yeah.
then I
But
thought,
see,
wow.
and she is a cultivated woman who's moving with the company, with support, with a network. What about migrants or what about refugees that have
Exactly.
none of that?
None of that.
They go through hell and back.
Absolutely.
And
And I mean, additionally, they often now have very awful experiences, traumas, and so on. So that adds to everything else. Yeah.
And in those cases, what we've observed is that many people who have to leave their home countries, not who want to leave their home countries, but
Don't
who
have too
have to
much.
leave their home countries, usually have attachment issues
Yes.
because they don't choose it
Yeah,
and they
exactly.
grasp on to their
Exactly.
roots. Yeah.
But I think that's more understandable. That's
Yeah.
surviving because you don't
Yeah.
know and you experience awful things. So I just had a student. He actually migrated from somewhere in Africa to Switzerland, and he started to tell me the story. I mean, wow.
Yeah.
Yeah, awful.
Yeah, and we don't realize that it's difficult enough to have to leave your country, your family, your culture, your rules, your habits, and enter a completely unknown place where people behave in ways you don't understand. And in many cases, you don't even speak the language.
Yeah. And you oftentimes, I mean, he said, oftentimes you are then, people are biased because you're a migrant and they have these images in their head and they don't give you a chance. And, uh,
Yeah.
and, and he was like, this was really awful when I realized that. Even now his skin is colored, he's colored. So
Mm-hmm.
he says, even now people, I'm in Switzerland for quite a while, and he's studying at university. So he found his way. But he said, even now, people talk to me in English and I answer in Swiss German and they continue talking in English. And he said, and, I mean, I just don't understand it.
And it's funny because if he tried to speak in English with them, they would answer in Swiss German.
Probably. But I thought, yeah, but it's interesting from a human point of view. Here's
Yeah.
a person who looks differently than me. I start to talk in English, and he answers in my mother tongue, and you continued speaking in English.
Yes. Yes.
Incredible, isn't it?
It's one of those things that people who move sometimes encounter,
Yeah.
and you have to learn to deal with that.
Hmm.
So when we talk about this attachment to roots,
Yeah.
we were saying that some people really suffer a lot because they can't let their roots go. Then we spoke about those who get lost because they don't know where their roots went and they don't know who they are anymore. And let's focus a little bit on the second group.
Hmm.
This second group usually faces a set of challenges that are different from the challenges that those attached to roots suffer from. These people are completely detached. They're
Hmm.
like free floating
Free
and they
floating.
don't
Yeah.
know, yeah, and they don't know who they are. But
Yeah.
the problem, and let me see if you agree with this, the problem is that they don't attach to the new culture either. You know,
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
they,
Yeah.
they,
That's my observation too. Yeah.
yes,
And I
uh-huh.
think oftentimes it's from a younger when from a younger age. I observe if you then move around, like it's so confusing that you just don't know anymore where you are.
Hmm.
And I think that's this free floating. And I
Yeah.
think there it's very important to help those people to connect to their roots
Yes.
and figure
Yes.
out who are you. Because
Yeah.
back to this example of this guy I was talking to with three different backgrounds and being there and there. And so I use an assessment to assess the cultural sensitivity. And my experience over this year is to see if you're not clear who you are, you cannot really interact or take another foreignness. It's really interesting. So this guy, I could tell he really had this bridge building inside him, but he didn't understand yet who he is as a cult, what is his identity out of everything he got. And then I think it's too much if you then again are faced with foreignness, and that creates anxiety. You start to defend it. And so in this continuum of this assessment, there is one phase called defense, and he was in this phase. He defended whatever he need. So it was, yeah, too much. And I can understand it's overwhelming
Yeah.
if you already have
Totally.
whatever inside you, and then another foreign part, a strange part you're
Yeah.
faced with. Okay. So
Yeah.
I think it's
Absolutely.
really important to reconnect with your roots to figure out who am I, because then this gives your stability.
And see, it's funny because in that process that you're commenting, I also met people who understood who they were,
Hmm.
discovered who they were, and then chose to connect to the new roots and let the old ones go. That
Hmm.
is, for example, my father.
Yeah.
My father, American, came to Spain when he was in his 20s,
Hmm.
met my mother. 11 days later, they had already agreed to get married. He went back. That's another story. So they got married. They got married and they went to the US because he had to complete his studies. He was studying applied linguistics. And then a few years later, my brother and I were born. My father missed Spain so much. Not
Mhm.
my mother, who was the Spanish one. My father missed Spain so much that they returned to Spain.
Wow, yeah.
And some years later, my father became a Spanish citizen and
Yeah.
rejected completely the American citizenship.
Interesting, yeah.
Yeah. So you see how that can completely change in one of these processes. And in that way, it's not that he's rootless again,
Oh, no,
is that
no,
he's attaching to new roots, right?
exactly. And I think what is that's a very good example. What is very important to see is that your cultural identity is dynamic, you know, it's not
Mhm.
fixed. And sometimes
Mhm.
people tell me, oh my God, I lose my identity. I'm like, no, you don't. Of course, it's dynamic. I mean, it depends what experience do you have and things like that. It's really, really important to see that it's nothing. I think people who think it's fixed, that's an attachment too, you know,
Yes.
this is me, or I'm Swiss and I'm losing my identity and things like that. No, you don't. It's dynamic, you know. I mean, when I was 16, I went the first time to the US. When I arrived and I traveled around, and I saw this great landscape, you know, and everything was bigger, and I felt much more free than in Switzerland. So, and then I realized, hey, I have a value of freedom, you know, I like to be free, but within a certain cultural context, you can't live it. So I think it's also this discovery that as your dad, he might have discovered, okay, Spain much better suits to my soul or my whoever, you know, and so that's where I would like to live. Yeah.
You see, I usually compare that to a river. You know,
Mhm.
you're born at the mouth of the river, and the
Mhm.
river flows, and
Mhm.
you get carried away with the river. Does that mean that you're not the river anymore because you're downstream? No, you're still
Oh,
the river, but you
absolutely.
just covered much
Yeah.
more territory. And
Absolutely.
yeah, and I usually tell my clients it's not that you're losing your identity, you're
No,
expanding it.
exactly. And I
Mhm.
like it. You know, the river, it's flowing, it's
Mhm.
dynamic. It's not like the small pond, and here I am.
Yeah. Yeah, and see, that's also it. I think that those who are like ponds, they're static,
Mm.
uh, suffer much more because they are
Yeah,
attached to their roots, to their
absolutely.
stability, their,
Yeah,
yeah, closeness. Yeah.
yeah,
There's one more thing that I'd like to discuss with you, Krista, and it's the kind of people, and we see this all around the world, okay? The kind of people who have to move or move and then go to the second country and just mingle and mix with their same people. For
yeah,
example,
yeah,
Little
yeah,
Italy in the US,
yeah.
all Italians, or Chinatown, only Chinese. That's another kind of attachment to roots, I think. You
Absolutely.
know?
Yeah, I think these people are looking for their home in the other country, you know. I mean, from Switzerland there are some Swiss clubs around the world, and it's
Yes.
incredible, you know. If you go there, you're like, hello, but it's even a bit exaggerated, you know. It's like really sticking to my tradition and everything. I mean, nothing against it. And I learned when I was in the US, I was with a friend of mine. We were consulting a German club, and because they had a bit of differences between the younger and the older generation. And then it
Mhm.
turned out, and I first really understood that a lot of those people were immigrating to the US during bad times here in Europe as Italians and so on. So that was much more a survival mode, you know. So I can understand why you then have the need to stick to your own people and together to survive. But then younger people entered, and so it didn't work anymore because they were like, okay, let's get to know each other, and so much more a different need. So I think that's important to see why this happened, and of course,
Yes.
yeah, if you then stick to it all the time, yeah,
Yeah.
back to the
And
point.
then those people have children, and their children are attached to the second country because they are born there, their friends in school are there. And then we have this situation at home that can cause a lot of friction and a lot
Yeah,
of difficulties
yeah.
when you have the parents attached to some roots and the children to other roots. Do you work with this kind of problem? Do you help people with this kind of issue?
Yeah, I was working with immigrants. I just had with the what is it called, the child protection people here in Switzerland when there's something happening, and there were some issues like that. So people coming to Switzerland, and then they were raising their children, in their sense, like at home. Nothing against it, but especially the teenager girl, one of them was of course much more adapting to Switzerland and so on.
Yeah.
So yeah, there was an issue. Mm,
Yeah, because there's different routes and different approaches, and that
absolutely,
must be
yeah,
very tough.
yeah.
And then you have other people. I'm thinking about another example. My aunt Sally. My aunt Sally, my father's sister, also came to Spain. I think it was because of my father. And she spent 40 years in Spain. She actually died in Spain. She was
Hmm.
an English teacher in Madrid,
Hmm.
and she never, ever, ever learned any Spanish.
Really?
40 years in Spain and she didn't speak
Yeah.
Spanish. Unbelievable, but true.
Unbelievable.
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
And it's
Interesting.
not, see, and the funny thing is not that she rejected the Spanish culture, is that she felt only comfortable among Anglo-Saxons.
Yeah, interesting. Yeah. I have
Another
another
example.
interesting example within the country. So I'm from
Uh-huh.
Switzerland, and Switzerland is tiny.
Yeah.
And there's this canton of Bern. And I once, in one of my training, there was a guy from the canton of Bern, and he was born in the Emmental, which is a bit, yeah. And then he moved a bit further down in the canton of Bern, and at the end he ended up in Bern, in the city of Bern. And he was at the age of 60, and he never ever left the canton of Bern of his whole life. And I thought, wow, And then first I thought he was joking because he was a very, very clever guy and very interested in everything. He read a lot of books and things like that. So I was first thinking he's joking, and then he said, no, it's my conviction. I'm not going to leave the canton of Bern. And then I tried to invite him and said, would you like to come to Winterthur where I live? You can board the train in Bern, and then and you end up in Winterthur. It takes you about 1.5 hours. And I said, I think about it. And next day he came back and he said, no, I'm not leaving the canton of Bern. And
Yeah.
I thought, that's an attachment. That's incredible.
Yeah, but let's explain it to those who are watching us, because I can imagine some people going like, well, what does that mean actually? Well, Bern is a very small city. It has
Yeah.
what, 700,000 inhabitants or
Yeah,
even less?
less, less,
I
less,
mean,
less.
it's a small, it is the capital city of the country, politically speaking, but it's a very small city. You
That means,
walk the city.
yeah,
You
you walk.
don't you don't need a car. It's a
No,
walkable city.
yeah,
And the whole canton is also quite small. From end to end in Switzerland, you do it
mhm,
in what, 3 hours?
3
You
hours.
can
Yeah,
cross Switzerland in 3 hours by car.
yeah,
And, from city to city, you might have 20 minutes.
yeah,
And
absolutely.
everything is completely, totally, absolutely connected by train. You can go anywhere in Switzerland by train, and the trains are always on time. So to imagine that someone never ever left the canton of Bern is like thinking somebody never left the New York City area.
Yeah,
That's it.
that's it. So Bern has 145,000
Uh,
inhabitants.
I'm very bad at figuring that. Yeah, very bad. But see, it's one of those things that people don't realize either, culture shock doesn't only happen when you go from one country to another country. It also happens when you go from one region to another region. In Switzerland, we have cantons. In
Yeah,
Spain, we have regions.
yeah,
And the regions in Spain are so different that
mhm,
they even have different languages, like
yeah,
in Switzerland.
yeah, exactly.
And if you go to the US, the North and the South, the East and the West are
Totally
completely
different.
different.
And I mean, even I had kind of a culture shock when changing a job. I was working at the court after I studied at university, and then I went to work for a bank. The first
Uh-huh.
3 days, I really had a culture shock because I thought, I don't understand those people. What language are they using? Also, they spoke in German, but the different words and so on. So I really realized I
Yeah, the
had a kind of
jargon.
culture, yeah. So it's
And that is also,
yeah,
that's also an attachment. You're not
absolutely.
attached to your roots in that sense, but you're attached to your job, to your ways, to your traditions, because being attached to one's roots means being attached to that,
Hmm.
to your ways, to your worldview, to your
Exactly.
traditions, to
Yeah.
your language.
And your
Yeah,
language, yeah, because I mean, these were two professional fields. And so, I mean, I was used to use the legal language at the court, and then you go into a bank and it's a different language.
completely.
I was like,
Yes.
excuse me, are we talking the same language? Yeah,
So
okay.
that's absolutely true, and it happens in everything. Okay, you mentioned before that people can and should get themselves ready, prepare themselves before they move. I
Mm-hmm.
would say even if it's within a country. Okay, guys, if you move, get a little information of the place you're going to. When I moved to Switzerland, when I moved to Russia, when I moved to Poland, those three moves, I received some cultural training by
Yeah.
professionals.
Mm-hmm.
And in that cultural training, they explained some of the basics of the country.
Mm-hmm.
They told us about, uh, how to go to the bank, how to open a bank account, how to go house hunting, the practicalities of
Yeah.
moving into a new country. They told us a little bit about the social habits of the people. In certain countries, like in Russia, the woman doesn't shake hands with the man
Mm-hmm.
initially.
Mm-hmm.
So they tell you that kind of detail. And they also told us a little bit about the history and the traditions in the country.
Yeah.
But that was it. I mean, it's a maximum 2-day training course.
Mm-hmm.
And then you're like dumped into the country and you have to navigate it. And
Mm-hmm.
there's so much more to learn, of course. So, as part of that training that you were saying, Krista, I also say you have to prepare your mindset. You have to
Absolutely.
go into the country with an
Yeah.
open mind.
Mm-hmm.
Stop the judgment. I mean,
Mm-hmm.
you're going into a new place. Don't go there to see what's different and to criticize everybody because you are going to suffer. They're not going to care, but you're going to suffer.
That's
And
true.
I also recommend that you give yourself some time. Give yourself the time to adapt.
Yeah.
What other recommendations would you give people, Krista, when they're
I mean,
about to move?
I mean, I did a lot of those trainings for quite a while at Novartis, and I also prepare students for their exchange semester. And I always tell them, don't just read a travel guide. I mean, that's okay, but really learn about the history, learn about the context, learn about the history, traditions, talk to people who have been there. You always find people, especially nowadays, on social media. Talk to them, get their advice, ask them how it was. Prepare yourself for culture shock. So that's something I think it's very important. So and it's easy. You just imagine you are in culture shock, you're feeling bad. What can you do to feel better, and that's also individual. Some say, okay, I'll call my mom, and others say I'm going to have a drink, and others say I'm going to run 2 kilometers and things like that. But it's important to prepare it. and to be aware of it. It can happen, and then you can much more consciously deal with it.
Yeah.
And then, of
Mhm.
course, if you move as a family, it's very important to realize oftentimes one of the couple is working and the other one is not yet working, and this is always also challenging. So I had once a couple. He arrived in Basel, I think three months before, and she was arriving 2 days before we had the training. And so he was like, yeah, okay, I'm already in the work process and so on. And she was like, oh, it's all you, and I'm sitting at home with my two cats. And then I realized they have such a gap between them, because he was like, hey, I'm tired when I get home. I want to relax. And she's like, oh, honey, you're coming home. Let's go out and dance and so on. So it turned much more in a kind of a consultant coaching for this couple and their marriage, and
Yeah.
into cultural training. But I found it so important because they had different perceptions. Was incredible. So that's something to pay attention to. Who is working, who is not, and what does it mean. And I think if you work, you maybe you quicker into everything than if you're at home and you're like, okay, so
Yeah. Yeah, and there's two things about that I'd like to mention. The first one is that I always recommend people to try and be curious, to keep their curiosity open, because if you're not interested about the place you're going to, if you're not interested in meeting people, if you're not interested in learning anything, just get some telenovelas, buy some books, and stay in your house, like if you were back in COVID times, because you're in a new world. I recall one day that I went out with some friends in Russia.
Mm-hmm.
We lived in a compound in a closed
Yeah.
place because for safety reasons we had to live in compounds back then. And I remember it was a multinational group of ladies. We'd gone to one of these fancy pantsy malls in Moscow to go shopping. And after shopping a little, we went to the food court to eat.
Mm-hmm.
And there were all these restaurants to choose from. Sorry. And I recall that I was the only one who bought Georgian food, not Russian, but Georgian is very similar. And I went back to the table, and everybody was eating either Italian or sushi, and that was it. And they looked at my food, and then they looked at me as if I was an alien came from space. And I said, "What's wrong? Oh, you like that?" I said, "I love it because I love Georgian food. Is wow." So I said, "What about you ladies? None of you are eating any Russian food." "Oh, no, that's not for me," they all said. "You don't like it?" "No, I never even tried it. But it's so different." I mean, come on, you're in Russia and you don't try and you don't
Yeah,
taste Russian food?
yeah,
That's the
exactly.
kind of mentality that I'm talking about.
Yeah.
Be open and curious. What
Yeah,
are
and
you
try
gonna do?
and try things out, and I
Yeah.
mean, I was teaching I was on a faculty exchange in South Korea, but I loved it because I tried the food and I went to the restaurant where you sit on the floor, like, okay, I didn't know where to put my legs, but I loved the experience. Like, but that's immersing yourself, and don't be afraid.
Yes.
I mean, people are nice all over the world. It's
Yes,
really nice.
yes. It's like when I was in Beijing, I was translating in a congress, and it was many years ago. It was about 25 years ago, and I arrived with my other interpreter.
Hmm.
We were there for 10 days, and the first few days we went out to dinner, and of course, no one spoke a word of English. Nothing. So we
Hmm.
went to restaurants and we couldn't communicate. So
Hmm.
I remember pointing at dishes that I saw people eating because
Hmm.
I could not read the menu because it was in their own writing, and it was the only way in which I could communicate what
Yeah.
I wanted to eat. So
Yeah.
be brave, be
Right.
daring, try it, go for it. Don't stay in your hotel room just
Uh,
eating the same international food. Yeah.
and
And
I once tested myself, by the way, because I thought, okay, I mean, how do I react to a country or to a culture I don't know at all? I don't know the language. I don't know anything. And then I went to Papua, which is
Wow.
yeah, and I did a kind of a hike to into the, it's called the Balian Valley, where there are still the tribes are living there. So we, of course, we had a local guide, because you can't go to the tribes and say, hi, I'm white. But it was so fascinating, you know. And what I learned most is you don't need to speak the language, because I kind of developed a language between a local guy and me within about 2-3 days. And so we had our hand sides, or we looked at each other, and we knew exactly what the other person was thinking or whatever. And I find it so fascinating, because we always think we need to learn the language, and that of course it helps. I'm not saying you don't, but there are other means of communication, and it worked perfectly. It was incredible, yeah. So that was a very
And
nice.
you
Sorry,
didn't lose your roots.
no, not at all. Mm-mm.
Not at all. So, for those of you who are afraid of losing yourselves, don't be afraid.
No.
Experience,
Mhm.
investigate, live, try, taste, and then enjoy the experience. You know, you might dislike certain things. That's fine,
That's
but you
okay.
try them.
That's
Yeah,
part of life, yeah.
yeah.
And I
There's
mean,
one last question.
yeah, we
Yeah.
had this one example that we had a very nice evening once, and there were the guide and his crew. There were about five local men, and they were in their hut and they were singing. You know, they had this ritual of the evening song and thanking for the day and so on. So very traditional, lovely. And so we said, "Oh, that's so nice. Can we join?" We asked, but we asked the guy. We didn't go there and say hello. And then he said, actually, that's only men, and but I'm going to ask them. And so he went to ask them, and they said yes. And then he instructed us how to sit there, not move at all, be quiet, just sit there. And it was the most beautiful moment. It was so beautiful, you know.
You see, but unless you're open, you don't enjoy those moments. And
Mm-mm.
that's a moment you will never forget in your life.
Ever.
Yeah.
But also, you know, you be respectful. Don't just go there and say, hey, can I sit with you, or sit. No, always respect, always ask if you know, observe. I think that's very important. Observe how people behave and so on, and then start to act. And that's oftentimes what I also can observe, that people just go and they do something, and stepping over boundaries. Yeah.
And
So it's
see,
also about respect. Yeah.
that's part of the problem. People don't learn. They're not keen to learn
Mm.
what the new country has to offer them. It's like tasting the food, you know? They're not willing to learn new tastes, new foods. They're not
Mm.
willing to learn their traditions. They're not willing to learn their culture. And that's how they never integrate. You
Mm-hmm.
know, as we were talking about the Little Italy, those people had difficulties integrating into their general culture
Yeah.
because they didn't want to learn. They thought that if they learned the other person's culture, they would lose theirs.
Yeah.
And
Exactly.
not
No,
so.
that's not.
Your
Exactly.
roots remain. You are a perfect example of that. So am I. Your
Yeah.
roots are safely kept by you.
Yeah.
One last question that I have for you, and I think it's also a very important one to discuss, and that is we were talking about those families who move for whatever reason, refugees, migrants, expats, it doesn't matter, and they have children. Well,
Mm.
those children don't choose to move, they're
Mm.
forced to move.
Mm.
And
Mm-hmm.
they often don't understand what's going on. And
Yeah.
they're brought to a new school where they don't speak the language and they have to fit in. And many of those children have mixed feelings about their roots.
Yeah. Exactly.
And my question has to do with parents. How do you think, Krista, parents can help children navigate that attachment to their roots
Mm.
under those circumstances?
Mm.
What do you think is a proper strategy for parents in those situations?
I think also it depends on the age the children are in.
Mm-hmm.
Because I think the younger it might be more easier, because they just I don't know. Correct me if I'm wrong, but I observe, you know, younger people. I mean, kindergarten and so on, they have this still the curiosity, and they figure it out, and sometimes it's much more the parents telling them, oh, be careful and so on. But later on, I think, especially teenage years, when you anyway have struggle with your identity and finding yourself, and if you then move around, I think that's much more challenging. And I think then the parents and I advice would give is really like preparing them, helping them to see where you're going to, as we said before, kind of train them, prepare them. Open discuss and have open talks about their struggles and things like that. It's always a question how you handle it, and how supportive you are, and how you support them, or you just go like, okay, here we are, and you go to school here, and things like that. So I think there's really an important supporting function of the parents, helping their children to get adjust to this new environment.
Yeah, but there's something else too, I think, Krista, which is how do you help those children? And I think this is related to what you just said. How do you help those children build their own roots and create their healthy attachment to their roots when they are in those moving situations? And one thing you said made me think that, of course, it's harder for teenagers because they already have roots and they've been uprooted and brought somewhere else. Whereas the younger ones are building their roots and they have no roots and they're just bringing them as they go. So, what can parents do to help those children have healthy, solid roots under those circumstances? Some parents try to send their children, for example, to their home language courses. So they learn the language. And they try to find other children who speak the language that they would speak at home, and families, so that their children can be exposed to their culture, whereas other parents don't do anything at all.
Yeah.
So do you have any tips or strategies for that? Do you think there's a right way or a wrong way?
Oh, I don't think there's a right way and a wrong way. I think it always really depends on the people, on the child, on the context where you are. I also know from family they celebrate their traditions and they keep celebrating them. Also, they might be in a different environment where traditions are different and so on. I think it's important to kind of keep the original cultural going, but also be open enough to see different things. And I think that's not an easy task for parents, actually.
No, it's not at all. I have two children, and we lived in 6 countries together, so I know it's not easy.
Exactly, exactly, yeah.
Yeah, it's,
and I
see,
think also again, children are individuals, and probably some are more open and others have more challenges, and
Yeah, but one thing that I personally find important is to keep a solid channel of communication at home. For example, one thing that we always insisted in doing at our place, in our house, was to have dinner together. My husband was working, the children were in school, I was busy with my own things, my humanology and all these things. And we always, every single day, try to have dinner together, to share experiences, to ask questions, because of course our kids had lots of questions every time we moved, and to somehow see that things were going okay. And of course, we shared our own cultures at the table in the house when we were together. So I think that is something really important.
Yeah, that's a very good point. I think to have your own family rituals, it's very important. Yeah. And I think really important, talk to each other.
Yeah.
Because nowadays often you can see parents on their iPhones and things like that. So it's not, but I think that's very important, exchange how you feel and so, yeah.
Yeah, I totally agree. Krista, it's been delightful chatting with you. I think this has been a very interesting conversation. I think that a lot of people need to hear these things because the world is in constant movement. There's
Ab-
more and more and more people moving around the world today than ever before in the history of humankind.
Absolutely.
So, yeah, and we need to be prepared for these things. And people think that's never going to happen to me. I'm never going to have to move. Don't be so certain, you know? Life changes like that. COVID taught us. So I think it's important to highlight these topics and to discuss them openly and to let people know that there's things they can do and that there's people like you, Krista, who, or us at the Institute who can help them and who can guide
Absolutely.
them. Yeah, and that there's a lot of studies and a lot of knowledge about this.
Yeah. And I think that's also important to see, because oftentimes people think, yeah, okay, easy peasy, I can handle it and so on. But I think no, my experience is no. I mean, hey, there are experts too, use them.
Yeah,
And let
totally.
let you, and I think that that's also an important point. When what I realize, some people feel ashamed if they feel challenged in a different country and so on. So I would say, don't feel ashamed, and if you really need help, get help.
Yeah, there's no shame in that at all.
Oh,
You know, the brave people are the ones who ask for help.
that's really important. Yeah.
Yeah, Krista, as I said, it's been delightful. I could
Here,
stay here and talk with you for hours and hours, but I know that you will be our guest some other times at the Institute, and I'm really
we
happy
have
about
fun.
that.
I'd love to.
Because well, we're all knitting this human tissue that we are in humanity. And this time we were talking about attachment to roots, but there's a lot to discuss about human beings. Thank you very much for your time.
You're very
Thank you
welcome.
very
Thank
much.
you. Was a
Thank you
pleasure.
very much for your knowledge also. I am really, really, really thrilled to have had you here. And to those of you who are watching us or who were watching before or who are going to be watching later, please leave your comments. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel. And remember that every month we have human dialogues, every month on a human topic. This one was on attachment to roots, but next month in April, the Institute's focusing on another fundamental human topic. The topic is anxiety. What, how, why, what for? And we're going to have the collaboration of another wonderful expert who's going to be discussing anxiety in public next April 8th here at the International Institute of Humanology. So please come and join us too. I'm Jessica Lockhart. It was a pleasure being with you all tonight, and I hope to see you in our next Human Dialogues.